will analyze three countries, Iraq, Syria, and Iran, and have a panel discussion on what went wrong in the process of democratization within these countries. With that being said, let me introduce to you our speakers who have the great expertise and experience within the MENA region. We first have Faisal, who is an Iraqi-born award-winning human rights activist, satirist, and writer. He's an advocate for universal human rights, secularism, and the free market of ideas, and is an enthusiast about the intersection of technology and advocacy. He's also the founder of multiple online platforms that together have more than 400,000 subscribers and millions of visitors. He previously worked for Movements.org as a programmer manager for the Middle East and North Africa to assist dissidents, closed societies worldwide. In 2015, Faisal received the President's Volunteer Service Award from President Barack Obama for his special commitment to education. Faisal has been published in the Huffington Post, Big Think, and is a columnist for the Free Inquiry magazine. He has also been quoted in publications like the New York Times, CNN, the Cornell Review, BBC World News, and The Spectator. We also have with us Jasu Nia, who is an Iranian-American human rights lawyer and is vocal on human rights initiatives in Iran. She completed her undergraduate degree in political science from UCLA and completed her law degree from Rutgers University of Camden School of Law. She has worked on war crime trials at the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, where she represented former governor ministers from Bosnia and Kosovo in pre-trial and appellate proceedings. She has also assisted in proceedings in the ICC related to allegations of crimes against humanity committed during the 2007-2008 post-election violence in the Republic of Kenya. She served as executive director for the Iran Human Rights Documentation Center during 2011 to 2014. Under her leadership, the center produced comprehensive human rights reports and documentation on political prisoners, women, ethnic and religious minorities, and other marginalized groups. She has also written for Foreign Policy, Politico, Huffington Post, and many more, and her expertise on Iran has landed her media platforms from BBC, CNN, Al Jazeera, and many more. And to introduce the moderators, I will moderate the event by asking questions for the speaker, and you'll have a chance to intervene as well. I'm not the only one who's going to ask questions. So if you have any questions that pop up during the Q&A session, feel free to ask whatever you feel like. Without further ado, I introduce you to Faisal.
Thank you so much for coming. I hope you're all doing well. Well, other than hang out at a bar with your Tinder dates. But before thank you so much for making this event, Monica. I really appreciate it. Before I start talking about, the title was about the failures of democratization, and I want to talk first about the successes and what we define to be the success and failure, so I can make it clear to the audience what I mean by that. So for me, success means respecting human rights and civil liberties, independent judiciary, separation of powers, and freedom of religion, separation of religion and state. The only country that came closer to that from the Arab Spring is Tunisia, and there is a book that I highly recommend called Tunisia and Arab Anomaly by Columbia University. So, and one of his major points that he mentioned about why it has succeeded is because they had a great education system, and it's the only country in the Arab world that has made more money on more money on education than on the military. So compared to Nasser in Egypt, compared to Saddam Hussein's Iraq, compared to Assad in Syria, it was the only quote unquote, it's a dictatorship by no means, but it was the only dictatorship that were kind of different than other dictatorships, which kind of with the argument that Mr. Nasser proposed is that they were predisposed to democracy. And Tunisia has a history of a version of a reformed Islam that is compatible with human rights and women's rights. So that's why you have laws proposed in Tunisia right now in which women have equal inheritance to men, which is not in anywhere in the Arab world, including Israel, which is not part of the Arab world. But and also women have the right to marry people outside their religion, which is also not allowed in pretty much all Middle Eastern countries, including Lebanon. So and it's also the only country where non-believers are not persecuted by law, and they have protection. So it's no surprise that it's the place in which set the motion for other parts of the Arab Spring. But according to his argument, which I definitely agree with, in which he mentioned Tunisia as an Arab anomaly. So the Arab Spring, as you know, started with Abdelaziz burning himself alive and setting the motion for other countries like Egypt and others. And you can see that in other countries around the Arab world that had an Arab Spring, the vast majority ended up in a very bad state. The country where I come from is the only country other than Libya which the dictatorship was removed by a foreign power, and today, actually yesterday, is the 15th anniversary of the Iraq War. But many people don't remember that Iraq had an Arab Spring-like protest in 1991 after the first Gulf War, in which Shias from the south and as well as Kurds from the north launched a revolution against Saddam Hussein, which is kind of very similar to what we have seen in Syria. And what happened is that the Kurds have won by establishing their own state, and with the help of the United States, they were able to establish a no-fly zone, while the Saddam regime was able to hold the regime in what's sometimes called the Sunni Triangle, which is the provinces from Baghdad to Crete and Mosul, which is no surprise became the holding place for ISIS. And he was able to sustain the power and eventually defeat the Shia uprising, which is what we see right now with Assad, in which there were 3 provinces, Damascus and Tartus and Latakia, in which they became the holding place for Assad regime, and he was able to crush, and as we can see, is a constant state of civil war. And then the other country is Yemen, in which there is also another conflict. And I think that sometimes what is ignored by analysts, especially on the Arab Spring, I mean, there are people who really compared it to the French Revolution. And that's one of the major fake news happened, is that there is this notion that just because Tunisia, where the thing started, suddenly means all the protesters from Egypt to kind of share the same values as the people fighting in Tunisia. And while it might be true that some people within Egypt and within Iraq were in favor of democratization, but sometimes people can have a different agenda than the already established dictator, and they also support dictatorships. As we have seen in the Iraqi opposition in 1991 and starting 2003, many of the people who were opposed to Saddam now support Assad, who is also a genocidal dictator. And that reminds me of a quote I was telling Monica if I can curse today, and she said it's fine. But which is a quote from FDR, and he was asked about this fascist dictator in Nicaragua, and they asked him, like, why do you support him? And he said, he's a son of a bitch, but he's our son of a bitch. And there are sometimes in the Arab Spring scenario and many of these protests is that you have, for example, the Shia Islamists who protested in Iraq are aligned with Iran and they're aligned with Assad. So even they hated Saddam, not because he was a fascist dictator, but because he was not their son of a bitch. So sometimes this kind of gets confusing, is that when people make kind of generalizations about the Arab Spring, and they think that all protesters are motivated by the same cause. And I'm hoping through this panel discussion to explain the nuance and the differences in many of these countries. So thank you so much for inviting me.
So when it comes to Iran, it's always hard to know where to start, because there is this incredibly long history, and in more recent history since the revolution of '79 and all the things that have happened after that on a micro level. My area is actually focused on human rights. So in full disclosure, I don't work on democratization, so to speak, day to day. But obviously a lot of what we work on in the human rights and civil rights space is really aimed at trying to help along the process that is going on there. And I don't know if I would view what's happening there as a sort of failure of democratization, more that we have gone through this experiment, if you will, with theocracy. And I think at the moment it's some
Theocratic regimes such as Iran.
Yeah, you go first.
Okay, well, this is an interesting question, because I think Iran, the trajectory of what's happened in Iran, I mean, every country in the Arab world is unique in its own way, of course, as Faisal pointed out. But the trajectory in Iran is a bit separate as well, just because of what's happened there. And just to do a super rough timeline, though probably, most of you, if you're in this room, you probably already know, but in more recent history, we had the revolution of 1979, which initially was led by many different forces, and it was, to get rid of the Shah, who was the monarch at the time. And there were, Tudeh party, Marxist sort of folks that were uniting with student activists and Islamists at the time to unite and overthrow what they viewed as a sort of imperialist leaning, sort of Western puppet regime. Their views, which we'll touch on later because it's interesting how views have changed and history has been revised and so on and so forth. But that revolution, of course, was ultimately, I don't want to say hijacked, but there was, the first supreme leader of the Islamic Republic, Ayatollah Khomeini, was very charismatic. He was living in exile at the time, and he eventually became the leader, sort of like the recognizable leader of this revolution. But it didn't start out that way, and that's a unique thing that I think that's a thing that a lot of people don't know, and even some of the leaders of our nations around the world don't know. And when they refer to it as Islamic Revolution, even though it really wasn't initially. And then what happened is, of course, as there was a referendum, and then the Islamic Republic came into being, and as it entrenched its power, one way that it did that was by jailing lots of dissidents, lots and lots and lots of dissidents, and in something called the 1988 massacre. The revolution happened in '79, and there was this slow process towards gradually entrenching power, really getting a chokehold over different parts of government and instilling this sort of authoritarian state. Some of it modeled on what came before, but some of it uniquely from the Islamic Republic. And during the whole of the decade, a lot of people were jailed. And then in 1988, there was a particular period of time within 3 months in which, according to some estimates, as high as 25,000 people were summarily executed in prisons. So it was a brutal crushing of dissent. This, of course, predated a time in which there was social media, or which there was sort of citizen journalism, where people could get videos out to the world on their phones and share what was happening. It also happened to coincide with the time that we were nearing the end of the Iran-Iraq war. I don't know why I just looked at Faisal.
I'm sorry about that. We all make mistakes.
Which was a tragedy for both our countries. 1 million people lost, I think, on each side, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah. So, but it coincided with that period, and so I think there was also, Amnesty International existed back then. There was the UN, right? But I think it was also a period of time in which there wasn't a lot of attention to what was being paid inside of those prisons, because there was a lot of attention being paid to having this conflict come to an end, right? So it was sort of under the cover of this that happened. And so just to run through quickly, after that, many different, we've had ebbs and flows. There's been people who have been labeled as reformists who've been elected into power in Iran. Those are people that seek to reform the system in some ways, some more genuinely than others. There are people who are middle of the road. They're sort of just centrists, if you will. And then there's hardliners. And those folks in the government are people who advocate for the harshest sort of gender segregation, the harshest laws against women, the harshest sort of punishments for morality crimes. So they'll typically lean very right on those issues and very, very conservative leaning. So we've had these ebbs and flows in governance in Iran, and prior to this most recent spate of protests, the reason that I even got into this work was in June 2009, there was a disputed presidential election in the country. Some of you might remember it. They called it the Green Movement. You'd see people in green in the streets. It was covered a lot by Western media, but then Michael Jackson died, and then it wasn't covered really anymore. True story. But that was an interesting period of time, because there was a very strong opposition candidate named Mir Hussein Mousavi, who currently is under house arrest. He's been under house arrest for years, and I'll get into that later. But he ran against the incumbent Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. Some of you might remember him from his very interesting speeches, interesting for lack of a better word, at the UN General Assembly every year. But that happened, and then I think a lot of people were convinced that Mir Hussein Mousavi would win, and he didn't, and the results were immediately announced. I remember voting in the election. I was living in Holland at the time, and I went to the Iranian embassy there and voted for Mousavi, as many of my compatriots did. But then Ahmadinejad was announced to be the winner almost immediately. And I remember hearing that and thinking, well, I mean, it just seems so improbable because there was this real zeal for Mousavi. And it could be. Later studies have come out that have shown that it's not entirely clear whether or not Mousavi actually won it or not. But the amount, I think I forget the exact number, but they had said that Ahmadinejad had won it by like a sweeping, like an astounding sort of dictator-style election majority. And we just knew that that couldn't be right. And so people hit the streets and they were peacefully protesting. And the reason that I lay this out just as a refresh is because it contrasts a lot with what happened at the end of December and that went on into January of this year. But at that time there was peaceful protest, it was very organized, there was a lot of leading activists, women's rights activists, student activists, labor union activists, a lot of different folks coming together and organizing these protests, very peaceful, very streamlined message, just asking for a recount, asking, the cry was like, where is my vote? And slogans and all of that, but all very peaceful. What happened next was that, and this was in 2009, of course, so this was before the so-called Arab Spring. And what happened was that the Iranian government brutally cracked down on peaceful protesters. So rather than deal with peaceful protesters with peaceful means or try to address the concerns of the nation in a way that allowed for reforms or sort of came to some kind of compromise with these folks, instead they decided to meet it with violence. There were Basiji forces, which is a special part of the IRGC, out on the street beating people with batons. A bunch of protesters were killed. There was one protester in particular named Neda Abba Sultan, which a lot of people remember because she was a woman who was shot and then she bled to death in the street, and there was video of that. This was a time in which the protests happened at a time when Twitter was a very nascent platform, but people started using it a lot during the course of these events. And I remember kind of monitoring that in real time, signing up, looking at it and seeing what was happening, and her death and the video of her death was everywhere. And it looked particularly brutal. She was a beautiful young woman. She was just killed on the street, and there was no sense in that act. She clearly wasn't somebody who would have been, physically dangerous. I mean, it didn't look like she was armed, right? So I think that hit a lot of people around the world, and we noticed this incredible international solidarity with what was going on, and that was unique. And eventually the protest fizzled out because there was such force that was applied. And in Iran, you don't have small arms, so it's a bit different than in the U.S. where you have guns and, as we know, and things like that. You don't have it. So there's really no way, even if the protesters had wanted to counter things with violence, that wouldn't be possible within that system. It's quite a closed state. And so they fizzled out. And so what happened is, since then, I think Iranians have become somewhat resigned to their fate, in that happened. They were dealing with the negotiations around the nuclear deal. I think there was a lot of hope around, could things change? Could this nuclear deal have us re-enter the international community? Will we not be in international isolation anymore? Because some of the leaders have really led them to a place where crushing sanctions, not being invited to be part of regional compacts and really having a robust role within the international community, and it was just becoming increasingly isolated. So when people voted in the election that followed the 2009 presidential election, so when they voted in 2013, I feel like a lot of the folks who had even suffered personally still went ahead and voted. And I think it was a really difficult decision for them to vote in a system that they think is illegitimate, but which they don't really have any other viable alternative. And they sort of resigned themselves to this idea that Rouhani, who's currently the president because he won a second term, that he as a centrist would bring some kind of reform to Iran, or at least that he would get a nuclear compact signed so that Iran could somehow re-enter the community of nations. Fast forward to a few months ago, a lot of longtime Iran observers said that they were shocked when what seemed to be like spontaneous protests erupted right at the end of December. It was right before the New Year here in the U.S. I wasn't that shocked, and I wrote a piece about it. I tweeted about it a bit, just a little bit. I do no longer work. I used to run an Iran human rights group for years, and really was quite involved in getting political prisoners released and that sort of thing. But I now work on refugee and migrant issues, and so I don't work on Iran day to day necessarily. And so I was just sort of casually tweeting about it based on my prior work, and I was saying it's not really that shocking because these protests were not happening in Tehran, they weren't happening in the capital, they were happening in towns and cities all outside of the capital. And these are people who've been, consistently disenfranchised, they're people who are marginalized, they've had long-standing grievances, and they have been manifesting protests in smaller ways, but there's been labor activists protesting in all these cities. There's different ethnic minorities in these places, like in Afwas was one of the places where there was a lot of protests. That's home to Iran's Arab minority. In Kurdistan, the Kurdistan province and Kermanshah province, there were a lot of protests. That's where the Kurdish minority in Iran is. So it wasn't really a shock to me because they've been protesting throughout the years. But a lot of observers who write about this for international publications said that they were shocked. And I think part of the reason they were shocked is because the demographic of folks who made up these protests is so fundamentally different than the demographic of folks that made up the protests in June 2009, which was very urban. It was largely centered in Tehran. It was led by activists and even reformists that a lot of people know, and a lot of people who work outside the country would know them and speak with them. They tend to come from more urban backgrounds, and they would know these people, and that's more likely than other folks who, a lot of the people that I worked with when we compiled our human rights reports were members of ethnic minorities, religious minorities. They were people who came from pretty humble backgrounds, they had never been to Tehran, and we had to really try to scout them out to interview these people, get to know their stories, meet them in third countries, whatever the case may be. And so I wasn't shocked, and then somebody from Politico asked me to write a piece about it because he saw some of my tweets, so I did. And then just about how the makeup of the folks who make up this protest are so different than what happened before. So it shouldn't be shocking, it's just different, and maybe people don't talk to them. And then that really, I feel, it's not like my piece did it, I feel just the conversation opened up then, and then there was a lot of, I think, introspection about why this is happening, why in this moment. And the conclusion that I've come to when all is said and done is that there is just no legitimate way for people to air their grievances within the system. There's no civic or political process in which that's transparent, in which they can be a part of. They cannot call elected leaders to tell them what the concerns are as constituents. There are not means by which that they can make their government work for them, and it does not represent them. So really, there is no alternative but to hit the streets, and it's really as simple as that. So the one thing I'll say, and then I'll turn it over, is sorry, I'm just gonna, but about the link between the two, because I said that Iran is sort of on its own trajectory in a way, but one comment has stuck with me, and I don't know how true it is, and that's why I'm curious to know your thoughts. Actually, I was in Jordan in the winter of 2010, and it was December 2010, and it was right around the time that Tunisia was happening, and then it was directly preceding events that would happen in Egypt and Syria and so on. And I was meeting with one of the fixers for a newspaper in the U.S. She's a Jordanian fixer, but she helps different journalists that I knew, and we were just in her home in Amman and chatting about what was happening in our part of the world. And she told me that a lot of people on the Arab street really looked at what happened with the Green Movement in Iran and admired it, and sort of were talking amongst themselves about that as an example of something that they thought was inspiring, and were sad, and that they were disappointed that it hadn't actually led to anything of fruition, or it didn't lead to any tangible outcome. And I thought that was so interesting because I hadn't heard that, and she thought that some of the stirrings of what was happening could have in a way, have sought inspiration from what had happened in Iran. And I thought, really? I wasn't sure. But it was an interesting
Yeah,
observation.
there is some truth to that.
Okay.
To add, the Arab Spring happened as a result of the rise of social media and the internet, and people are seeing what's happening in other parts of the world. And Iran was one of the countries that they look at themselves, they look around, and they're like, why not me? Why people in Iran are allowed to protest and they have visions, and if I go protest against Mubarak, I will get killed. Or if I protest against the Tunisian regime, I would get killed. So that's one of my, that's one segment of the protesters in the Arab Spring, where happened as an inspiration of what's going on other world in the world. They look at also Western media. The thing is, like in the Arab world, we have access for the most part to see Friends and Seinfeld and all of these shows, and we can see what's happening. Like we can see New York, we can see LA, at least the whatever American propaganda puts in Hollywood, but not so American propaganda, but kind of the American way of life. And we look at that and we're like, why not us? Why somebody is allowed to have a private sector, they can open a business, but we cannot? For kind of a country like Egypt, in which that 95% of the wealth is concentrated under 0.5% of the population. So you have the majority of Egyptians really living under poverty or below poverty, and that's what represents kind of the young people who are really also inspired by the Iran Revolution, other parts, not the Green Movement, that to conflict with the other Iran Revolution, because there are many of them. But so that's one element. Back to your question about the people who really went to the streets, and that's, I think, what really represents the young population who really were looking around. They're kind of tech savvy in a way that they know how to use Twitter, they know how to use Facebook, sometimes using a VPN, because some of these countries don't allow access to some of these websites. And there is the economic reason, which is kind of linked to that. And that also includes other people of the population who might not necessarily be tech savvy, but that they living in a miserable economic situation. And then there are, and sometimes people conflate some of these things, is that somebody can be an Islamist protesting for Islamist purposes and economic purposes at the same time. Because sometimes is that people think is that you either protest for this and you have a materialistic ends of why you're doing what you're doing, or you have a theological ends. Is that, the Muslim Brotherhood, which is the party that won in Egypt, one of their main core principles is social and economic justice. So you can still believe in economic justice and be an Islamist at the same time. So you can pursue a materialistic kind of ends and at the same time believe in an afterlife, and what you're doing is you're doing for kind of a theological purpose. The only time, so when it comes to the Syrian conflict, I think what is that the Syrian Arab Spring are also connected to Iraq in a way. it happened after the Iraq chaos. So many of the rebel groups, Islamic states started in Iraq before it started in Syria. So Abu Mus'ab al-Zarqawi, who is considered the founder of ISIS, not Obama, according to Donald Trump. Obama is not the founder of ISIS, just want to make that clear. Abu Mus'ab al-Zarqawi is the founder of ISIS, who was the leader of AQI, which is Al-Qaeda of Iraq, that eventually, and when he saw the chaos happening in Syria and the rebels and Assad regime response, he sent an ambassador to Syria to see if it's possibility with the chaos existing in Syria, there's a possibility that ISIS can expand. And that's where there was a split between the Nusra Front, which was Al-Qaeda of Iraq, and then the more extreme version of Al-Qaeda, which is ISIS or IS, and then became the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. So to some extent, what happened in Iraq had a major effect of what's happening in Syria, which also had multiple group of people protesting with very different agendas, which I was talking about in the beginning of the panel discussion. Is that you have hundreds of protesters, and you ask 10 of them why they're protesting, they give you 25 answers. And when I was interviewing many of the protesters that I know online, or I met them, and I'm like, why are you protesting? And they might give you different answers depending on the mood of the day, which makes sense why groups like the Muslim Brotherhood and others were able to win, because they were also the most organized. They had the most dedicated answer. The first time in which there was a protest, or that I find it close to my heart, other than the Tunisian one, which I think have succeeded, and I hope succeeded because they cared about multiple things, not just economic justice, but also civil liberties, is the Iraqi 2015 protests in which, for the first time, there were more people protesting for civil liberties, protesting for civil rights. That was not just about economic justice. I mean, I do support economic justice, but economic justice, as I said, can be compatible with views that are not necessarily defending of civil liberties or human rights. And then there are people who sometimes referred to as the Arab nationalists, who have more anti-West tendencies. So they think of Mubarak, they think of many of, including the King of Jordan, as kind of puppets to the Western imperialism, and they feel that these people do not represent what they think of as an Arab nation should be. So there are all these factions that, as I said, protesting, as you mentioned, is that why they are protesting. That many of them are really protesting for different reasons. And to summarize it, so it's the young people who are inspired. They look at the online world, they see what's happening in the Green Revolution, they see what's happening in the West, they want to feel something similar. And there is the economic justice movement, which includes the youth and some old people who live in miserable conditions. And then there are the Islamists who feel that they are not represented, and they think that the governments are Western puppets, and they want to implement a more theological regime. And in Iraq, I mean, Iraq is a different case because the United States took the dictator, and so that really many of the protests. But it's no surprise that in Iraq, the people who, as I said, the Arab Spring, the pre-Arab Spring, which happened in 1991, became the first rulers after 2003. So the 1991 revolution that started in Iraq, called the Intifada al-Sha'baniyya, because it started in the Sha'ban month, and so it was the Da'wah party and which is the ruling party right now, and Abdulaziz Hakim. Both of them went to Iran. They are Shia Islamists, and they are very organized. And then with Saddam Hussein crushed them with the help of the MEK as well. And but they were the most organized, even though Saddam crushed many of them. When the Iraqi elections happened in 2005, the constitution happened in 2005, and then the first Iraqi election happened in 2006. They were the most organized compared to the liberal and more the secular people who, many of them really had different agendas. But Al-Hakim and the Da'wah party, which had Maliki and now the Prime Minister Abadi come from, were the most organized. They had a very organized agenda, and they also had the theological support. Ayatollah Sistani, God bless him, said that if you don't vote for the Shia party, the coalition 555, your wife is not allowed for you. So all of the marriage will be cancelled. And for a group, the South, that it's unfortunately because of war with Iran, 8 years, and then the war with Kuwait, lives under so much deprivation, lack of education. It's easy for them to be manipulated by a fatwa like this. And now we have what we have right now. So Iraq has become a different case because it had an outside force that ousted the regime that exists in power. But when it comes to other nations, I mean, especially Syria, it's kind of, there's some similarities that the ones that are more organized became kind of on the front lines, which are mostly the Islamists, which is unfortunate.
Okay. And the next question I want to ask is, how much role do you think women played throughout these protests and the Arab uprisings, and even in the Iranian protests? I know with the Iranian protests, a lot of people changed their Facebook profile to a woman had a stick with a hijab on, waving it. So how much do you think women have say in these protests?
So this has been a serious point of contention, actually, after what happened in December and January. When it came to the June 2009 protests, that was strongly led by women. And there's a report that I published for the NGO I was running at the time that actually had quite a lot of evidence showing that the reason that long-standing women's rights activists were one of the first targets of the Iranian authorities in the aftermath of this disputed presidential election was because they knew that they had the know-how to organize these wide-scale protests, and that they were playing a very leading role there. And it's true. There's been a long-standing women's rights movement in Iran This dates all the way back to the times of the Constitutional Revolution at the turn of the last century, right? So it's a long time in the making. And after the 1979 revolution, and after a lot of women's rights were repealed, and there were different restrictions placed on them in accordance with Sharia law, they had since mobilized a massive grassroots movement. There were different things like the 1 million signatures campaign to combat discrimination against women. There were different groups that were set up to combat the application of the death penalty, which is disproportionately applied to women when it comes to morality crimes, not for other things like drug trafficking and things like that, but for morality crimes, so it's like adultery and whatnot, it's disproportionately applied to women. There were a lot of these sort of grassroots efforts, and so women have been organizing consistently throughout this time. During the presidency of Khatami, who was like late 90s, very early 2000s, he was seen as a reformist, and under him, civil society was actually allowed to flourish. And there was a time when Rivos in Holland would be able to operate inside the country, right? So this is a long time off. That would be unheard of today, to have international NGOs that are doing human rights work, supporting on-the-ground activists there. So it was a different time. These NGOs flourished. There was a flourishing of civil society. Of course, there were restrictions, and there was definitely a conservative hardline push to get these groups in check. There was at least a space within which they could function. All those folks today, all those people who led those movements, have all been forced into exile. Some were subject to long periods of arrest. This all happened after June 2009. It was happening during Ahmadinejad's administration, but really accelerated after June 2009, to the point where they were just wholly dismantling civil society. So a lot of those leading women's activists don't live in Iran anymore. Even our Nobel Peace Prize laureate, Shirin Ebadi, who is this fantastic woman lawyer who's defended a lot of different women in different cases. I mean, she lives in exile, so even our Nobel Peace Prize laureate doesn't live there. So fast forward to what happened in the end of December and early January. There is a new crop of lady activists who are active, and I don't want to say they're disconnected to the old activists, it's just a different generation. And a lot of those older activists were forced into exile, so all their know-how, some of it got passed down in different ways, but a lot of it they weren't capable of organizing alongside the younger generation anymore because they physically weren't there. But that symbol that you saw, the sort of avatar of the woman who has the white hijab on a stick, that was sort of became like the symbol of the unrest, but it actually wasn't connected to the protests. So what that was a part of is something called White Wednesdays, which is a campaign that somebody named Masih Alinejad, who is a Iranian, she's a journalist, she was a former journalist that covered parliament in Iran, and she has become an activist in exile. And she created a platform where it started spontaneously, but she has this wonderful, curly, abundant hair, and she used to wear the hijab. And after she stopped wearing it, it just, it's free. It's like everything that hair would want to be if it's not constrained under a covering. And so she had put this photo of her on her Facebook, I think it was her Facebook, and it's a fairly well followed Facebook. She has a lot of followers, and there was something about it's like the wind through her hair, or some sentiment like this, and a lot of women started spontaneously saying we wish we could do that too. And this was in Iran, and so for everybody who doesn't know, there's mandatory veiling laws in Iran, which is unique. A lot of countries, culturally, you might want to veil, but you typically have mandatory veiling laws in the books, but you do in Iran. And so she had posted this photo, and then people were just uploading videos and photos of them with their hijabs off, which is against the law in Iran and can come with penalties. And they were doing it sometimes just in the privacy of their own cars or whatnot, but sometimes it was out in public. And so that's a very daring and bold act. And the platform grew, and it's called, the English name is My Stealthy Freedom. And so this has grown over the years, and then the White Wednesdays is like a specific part of the campaign where on Wednesdays women wear a white hijab and they take it off as part of this campaign. And so she was part of that, but it happened like directly before the protest. And so when the image had been uploaded, people thought that it was associated with that because it looked like a very defiant act, which it was, of course. And then after that, there was many women who started to publicly protest the hijab laws by standing on platforms in very crowded intersections and busy streets and cities in Tehran and in Tehran and other cities. And so this is all very bold. And some of them have been arrested. One of them was released. The original woman who was part of, that photo, that original photo, she's been released. She's a mother of a small child. But others have been sentenced, and I want to say that there was 29 women, I think, who were arrested. I have to double check, but this was a sort of, it seemed spontaneous. I think since then there's been a degree of coordination. So I want to say that women have been continuing their defiance and their opposition to gender discriminatory laws. It wasn't necessarily connected explicitly to the protests that we saw. The protests that we saw, in fact, some were mixed. There was men and women, but a lot of them were actually young men of a certain age hitting the streets, very angry. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, she made must. I mean, all I would say is that the women played a major role during the Arab Spring, and I mean, I second statement made by Mona Tahawi, who's a writer from Egypt, and she mentioned that, there would be no successful revolution or successful Arab Spring without a social revolution that would include women's rights. So I think it's very important that there are many women out there in front, but there is some misconception being made, especially when it comes to the Iraqi parliament, is that so the Iraqi Islamist parties, and mostly the Dawah and Hakim party, they have included many women in the parliament, but in a weird way. And they make this argument is that, look at Iraq, we are actually a socially progressive country, we have more women in parliament, and what sometimes happens is that really the most extreme anti-women laws are passed by the women in the Islamist parties of Dawah. They wanted to have a compulsory hijab, at least in universities, and it was the party that has a kind of half 50% women were the ones advocating for a compulsory hijab. So don't be fooled to the people who are that just because, and CNN unfortunately fell to that trap, is that look at many of the countries that are becoming more progressive in the Arab world because now they have more women in the parliament. But having more women in the parliament is not necessarily, there's a correlation of women actually having more rights in many of these countries. And Pakistan had a woman president, Bhutto, and Bangladesh, many of the secular bloggers were killed in time in which, so unless there is this really socially liberal revolution led by women who support women's rights, I think that the Arab Spring it's not complete. And removing the dictatorship is not enough, as I said, is that having democracy is not enough unless there's the institutions and civil liberties for people, including women and minorities, to be there.
Okay. With the discussion of religion and politics, with Islamization, and then women being forced to wear hijabs in certain countries, how much do you think religion and politics play along in creating these oppressive theocratic regimes, even these secular regimes that we call under Saddam Hussein or Assad, that actually utilize Islamists for their own political purposes? People claim that it's either political or it's religious, but isn't when religion implemented systemically inherently political?
So the lens that I view that in is always going to be legal. So yes, I think. In Iran we have an Islamic theocracy, so it's there you go. It's built in. It's built in. That's it. It's a valiyat al-faqih, it's built in. So there's no getting around that. I mean, it's also in our laws, right? So I think there's this difference between countries that might be, you know, Islam light or Christian light, and where it's not really, like, they're not theocracies, and then you're gonna have a different mix there. With Iran, it is baked into our laws. So the criminal penal code, the Islamic Penal Code, yeah, it's called the Islamic Penal Code, there you go. So again, our criminal code is called the Islamic Penal Code. So yes, and sometimes that manifests in ways that are not destructive, and often it manifests in ways that are destructive. And particularly when it comes to women's rights, but also the rights of religious minorities, ethnic minorities to some extent. So I think I think with a society like Iran that is actually quite diverse, I mean, it looks homogenous in a way, I think from the outside, only because we don't have a lot of foreigners who come there because of obviously the difficulty in being granted a visa to come, the fact that you know, it's been isolated in different ways. I know tourists are increasing now, but it's not a place where you would see lots of tourists or foreigners when I used to travel there, even in like the late 90s and the early 2000s. But the society itself is quite mixed. I mean, you know, there are a lot of different ethnic minorities. It's not all Persian. You know, I myself am like two types of minority, right? So there's like Turks, there's Arabs, there's Kurds, there's Baluch. It's a mix, and there's a lot of different religions actually. And so although the state says that the population is 99% Shia, like that's not possible. It just can't be. You know, there's lots of Baha'is, which the state doesn't recognize as being a religion. They think they're heretics. There are Sunni Muslims. There are different like smaller religions that like Abnahab and stuff like that a lot of people wouldn't know about, and different offshoots of Islam. There's Sufis that are persecuted. You know, so there is a mix. There's Assyrian Christians, Armenian Christians. There's a lot of diversity actually, and I think that when you live under an Islamic state, the problem with that, of course, is even if that state bakes in respect for the rights of some of those communities. Like I should say that when it comes to monotheistic religions, the state is actually much more forgiving. So which is surprising for many to hear, because we often hear about the Iranian government's policy towards Israel, and then like automatically assume that then the Jewish minority in Iran must be doing like terribly, you know. But yes, it is not pleasant to live under, I would think, an Islamic theocracy when you're a minority religion, because obviously a majority religion is controlling things. At the same time, there are rights that, you know, Jews and Christians who were born Jewish and Christian are given that other religions aren't, because they're not recognized as religions, or because they're perceived as more of a threat to the state. So it's like that interesting thing where, yeah, you know, on the face of it, you could say, well, these rights are baked in. Like, you know, certain religions can like drink wine with their services. You can't drink alcohol in the Islamic Republic otherwise, because of course it's illegal. It's, you know, under Islam, and it's not allowed. It's forbidden. But you know, some of those religions are allowed that. So it's that odd thing where you can point to like the one or the two or the three examples where there's some provision made for rights, but overall it's obviously a very oppressive government, and the politics manifest in a way that is inherently going to be entwined with that religion, because it's a theocracy, and it's like a theocracy to the fullest extent of the law. And it's not a country yet in which it's just maybe a theocracy in name, but then not in practice. It's very much in the de jure institutions of the state, but it's also in the way it's practiced and implemented.
I mean, I second most of that. I want to focus on one word you utilize here, which is the word utilize. And in both the cases of Iraq and the Saddam regime and the Assad, is that if you think of many of these countries as ecosystems, right, in which, in a way, all of these people need each other to succeed. So I mean, so Assad it has been confirmed multiple times by military intelligence, both the Iraqi side and the U.S. side, that Assad played a major role in supporting Al-Qaeda in Iraq and training them inside Syria and Latakia and other places, and mostly to destroy the proposed democracy that would happen in Iraq after the 2003 war. And so, in a way, these kind of I wouldn't call them secular. I mean, Saddam Hussein, especially after 1991, is the one who put Allahu Akbar in the Iraqi flag, declared Iraq to be an Islamic state. Not as an Islamic State, ISIS, but it wasn't Islamism lights. But he closed all the alcohol stores, did this show in which there was a beheading of prostitutes in public to show that we're actually moving towards a more Islamic rule. But at the same time, they tried their best to empower the Islamists in a way, in creating kind of a binary choice between these people. It's like, you want theocracy? Look at Jabhat al-Nusra. I'm the only one who can defend you from Jabhat al-Nusra, or now it's called Fatah al-Sham. Marketing, they probably hired the PR company to do that. But all of these secular military dictatorships wanted the Islamists to some extent gain some power in order for them to maintain that binary choice. And in Egypt, one of Mubarak's main argument of staying in power is like, look, if I'm going to fall down, the Muslim Brotherhood is going to take in. And so the Islamists would want to protect you from the secular, let's say Assad, even though I wouldn't call him secular. But so the Islamists will say, I'm going to protect you from Assad, and Assad will say, I'm going to protect you from Islamists. Saddam Hussein, I'm going to protect you from Iran and Shia puppets to Iran. Sometimes refer to them as Ghawgha, which is the rats, the children of the rats. He also uses some good terminology like Trump in some regards. And and also with Egypt utilizes. So I think that if you think of many of these countries as an ecosystem, and really Islamists require this military dictatorship, and the military dictatorship require these Islamists, and that's why this situation is a stalemate in many of these countries in which they need each other to survive, because if the other side is removed, then the people will start asking for economic rights. And in Iraq, pre the war, whenever there is people asking why there are no good hospitals, why Saddam is building 20 mosques and 50 palaces, but there are no good schools, well, he will say, well, Israel and then Iran. That's the reason why you don't have any good schools. And Assad is doing the same thing. Why are you not giving us a good education system? Well, I'm spending my time fighting against Jabhat al-Nusra, I'm fighting against ISIS. So screw that, screw all your ambitions for a bit, because I have an enemy that we need to fight. So I think the word utilized is pretty accurate, because they all need each other to succeed.
Yeah. And going back to the recent Iranian protests, I have a question for you, Sue. In your recent article published by Politico titled "Why the Other Iran is Taking to the Streets," could you elaborate further when you mentioned how the Iran watchers were talking to the wrong Iranians?
Yeah, so I think I probably jumped ahead to that in my earlier comments, which was just that the protests of June 2009 were urban and demographic. They were largely centered in Tehran, and so they are the kinds of folks that people who operate outside of the country would be in closer touch with. The way I would compare it is to something like here in the US in the lead up to the 2016 presidential election, in that if you were observing some media, and if you were looking at some social media and traditional media, you would think that Hillary Clinton was going to win this thing by like a landslide, right? If you were looking at some media. In other media, there was a very different perspective. And I think some of that sort of filter is a similar thing that applied in Iran and in the way that people were observing this. A lot of the initial comments about the protests were, we called our contacts in Iran, nobody knows who these people are, with the strong implication that these were staged protests. They didn't come out and say that, but there was this sort of, very strong suggestion that it must be like Israel sending people in to just stage a fake protest and cause discord in Iran, or like maybe the US, the CIA, or and there is a long history of that there, I should add. So they're not incorrect to think that can happen sometimes. But I think there was that strong suggestion, and that's not what was transpiring here. And the reason that they weren't in contact was simply because a lot of the folks who were protesting were initially protesting about economic concerns initially. And they were maybe from a lower socioeconomic demographic. They're not the types of people that were in touch with, analysts at different think tanks. It's just not. It wasn't the activist class. It wasn't the intellectual class who was out in the streets. Very quickly, the slogans around economy switched to overthrow of the Islamic Republic, death to Khamenei, very bold statements that were clearly anti-government. But I think that anti-government statement is really, it's less about wanting to actually overthrow the regime and all the things that entails, and it's more about being frustrated and not understanding who is accountable in this system. Because they recognize that their economic situation is not doing well. They were promised that things would change after the nuclear agreement was signed. They haven't realized the benefits of that. They see that there's an uber wealthy class in Tehran that they're not part of. There's luxury stores being open, there's luxury cars driven in the streets, they're not part of that. And social media has enhanced the ability for people to see the disparity in wealth. And so they see that and then they're angry, and they're not the people who are talking to the experts on the outside, right? So I think that's what I was addressing a bit in the piece. And because we had worked with a lot of, at my NGO, we had worked with a lot of marginalized communities. We had worked with people who were not from wealthy or educated backgrounds. It was a challenge to be in touch with them for a range of reasons, but we managed to do that somehow. And because I knew about those long-standing grievances, I just wasn't that shocked that this happened. And when we called some of our contacts, it's like, yeah, they were going to protest. So slowly that news came out, but initially I think the go-to people who might have incredible expertise on the nuclear deal just wouldn't be tapped into those communities, so they just wouldn't know about it.
May I ask, what is the most common app in Iran for social media? Is it
Telegram.
Telegram? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Telegram, which the government had temporarily
Blocked?
They were blocking it, and they were slowing it down. They were blocking it, and they were making the founders, Durov and the other, they were making them shut down different public platforms, because obviously the way that they use it as a social network is Telegram has that function of being able to be part of public channels where you can broadly share information. So they were shutting down channels that were helping organize the protests. A lot of this was digitally organized. So,
yeah. And then back to you regarding Iraq. How much of Iran's influence over Iraq since the invasion of U.S. forces put back the democratic opportunities for Iraq? More specifically, since the purpose of Iran's influence in the Iraqi elections was based on sectarian motives, how did that hinder the future prospects of democracy and the prospects for a secular state?
Well, I mean, the influence, the ruling parties, as I mentioned, Dawa and Hakim, both were trained and lived in Iran during Saddam's regime. And so both of these parties, in Iraq is kind of a weird case. So every major political party has a militia on its side. And so Hakim has a Badr movement, and Dawa have their own, and the other guy, Muqtada Sadr, had Jaish al-Mahdi, used to be Jaish al-Mahdi, now it's rebranded itself as something called Asab al-Haq, which is part of the PMF forces in fighting against ISIS. Since the Iraq war started in 2003, the first Iraqi voting for the constitution started in 2005. Many of the major influencers in the elections who are the Shia parties were supported heavily by Iran. And most importantly, the influence on al-Maliki, you mentioned the question about the surge, but I don't know if you have time, but I want to talk about it. So the United States withdrew from Iraq under President Obama when he came to power, and one of the major points that Maliki, who's, as I said, very much aligned with the Iranian regime, made sure to cut the salaries of what the surge has established, what's called the Sons of Iraq or the Awakening Movement. The Awakening Movement, short history, is that they are mostly Sunni tribal forces in West Baghdad and West Iraq, organized by help with the United States military by General David Petraeus as a counter Sunni narrative to Al-Qaeda. And that's where they were making moves in removing Al-Qaeda from Iraq, mostly where I grew up in West Baghdad and West Iraq. And they were very crucial in defeating Al-Qaeda, AQI back then. And what happened with Maliki is that and he saw the U.S. withdrawal as a kind of an opportunity for him to assert his power and assert the more Shia dominance, is that he cut down the salaries, that he asked them to leave up many of their weapons, to weaken the Sunni, because he was afraid that if Sunni powers will become more powerful, that will damage the Shia establishment. So, I mean, Iran, the current government, even though with Abadi they kind of lowered down their relationship with Iran, but the former government with the Maliki, they were extremely aligned, and many of the militias from the Shia side have received a tremendous support from the Iran regime, and even some of the anti-ISIS movement, they get advice from Qasem Soleimani, who's also part of the. I don't want to look at you. I don't want to look at him, but Qasem Soleimani, I mean, visited Iraq multiple times. He is part of the Iranian government, and he has advised and many of the popular mobilization force who are on the front lines of fighting ISIS. So I mean, Iran played a major role, and it's understandably why. I mean, there are many theories and hypotheses why, but and that what goes back to us. I think the failure of the Iraq War. Today is the 15th anniversary. Is that you cannot establish a Jeffersonian democracy in which the whole region doesn't want any democracy to flourish. I mean, good luck with that. When you have Iran on the other side, on one side, and you have Saudi and Syria and Jordan, and we live in a tough neighborhood. I mean, it's not, and Turkey on the north now with Erdogan, it's going towards more of an Islam theocracy. But so I mean, Iran on one hand want to make sure that to get their allies to be in power, and the Saudis and the Emiratis played a major role in supporting many of the Sunni elements, and Iraq and Syria to some extent became a kind of a place for regional conflict of Iran and Saudi Arabia and the UAE and Qatar to some extent. Now they have switched. So to answer that question, the Iranian influence is as big as can get, and to some extent thanks to the United States and bad decisions and bad mistakes from both the Bush. I mean, the Bush administration called Maliki a man of peace, and the Obama administration, with knowing based upon all the facts that the Iraqi sectarian government would want to make extreme discrimination against Sunni Arabs, they still withdrew from Iraq, creating the vacuum that eventually led terrorist groups like ISIS to grow.
And regarding with Syria, I kind of want to jump into Syria. You have a brutal regime who's killed hundreds and thousands of innocent civilians. Now, many countries involved, either for sectarian purposes, or countries like Turkey, who have now taken over Afrin, killed hundreds of Kurds. What inference can you make about the future and future stability of Syria, and the likelihood that Assad would either choose to step down or will be forced to do so? And not just in Syria, you have countries like Yemen that is on the verge of total instability, and Libya. Will you see these conflicts dying out soon?
Short answer is no. I mean, the country that was close to Syria, Lebanon, the civil war lasted for 15 years. And after that, they had the Taif agreement, which kind of maintained some sectarian. I mean, as I mentioned in my previous, that you have in some sense now a stalemate, right? You have Iran, which is extremely powerful, at least by comparison to other parts of the region, and then you have the Gulf, which also has tons of resources, and you have Turkey, which cares more about the Kurds than they care about ISIS, which is interesting to mention. So when you have kind of an ecosystem that really most of them have the same power, then the likelihood of anyone winning is very unlikely. So what happens is that even if Assad and the Iraqi government made moves in removing some of the ISIS militants from there, the ecosystem for another Sunni militia to grow is very likely. I mean, if you think of ISIS as AIDS, and you think of the ecosystem that allows Sunni extremism to grow as HIV, then the roots for AIDS are still there. And which is that Sunni, many of them think they're not represented. They think that I interviewed a guy who lived under ISIS in Mosul, and I didn't go to Mosul. I just want to make sure for the U.S. government I didn't go to this territory. But And he mentioned to me, and he is, I would put him on the moderate spectrum when it comes to the line of extremism to a cultural Muslim. And he said to me that I would take ISIS over the Iraqi government any day of the week. So that is not so. So many people think that just because somebody lives under ISIS, like people of Mosul, and that means they are completely aligned ideologically or they are part of the terrorist group. But in fact, if you think about it, this sometimes is the way that they observe it, not that I agree with it, is that they see it as a lesser of two evils. Is that there is this group, while I might not agree with them on everything, but they represent a better option to me than the Maliki government or Assad government, who would throw up barrel bombs on my family. So I think that with all of these conditions for growth of extremist groups is still there, the likelihood that the situation is going to be a stalemate is likely. As in Iraq, even though we have, but the U.S. military plus the Iraqi military and the Sons of Iraq made an amazing moves in kicking Al Qaeda out of West Iraq and West Baghdad, and also to create in other provinces. I mean, back in the good old days, Al Qaeda was the biggest thing, right? Al Qaeda was the one that was also always on the headlines, on the front news. They made an explosion there, they made an explosion there. Now ISIS make Al Qaeda look moderate, right? And because the conditions for such groups to rise again is still there. So even though if there are successful military inside both Iraq and Syria, it doesn't mean that in 6 months, in which group of young people also feel marginalized, or they feel that they deserve a seat, and also you have a propaganda pushed to them by Al Jazeera and many states. I mean, just to give you a simple example, that like during the Iraq War, when there is an explosion happens in a Sunni neighborhood, they say martyrs, 15 martyrs died. When it's in the Shia neighborhood, they say 50 people dead. So you have most of the media in the Arab media that the Arab people watch to. You can see the sectarian, you have shows dedicated fully on demonizing of Shias, you have shows dedicated fully to demonizing of Sunnis and other minorities, and so you have millions of dollars spent on propaganda by regional powers, and always agitating people that there is a victimhood, like there's somebody who's going to kill you. And as long as the ecosystem for all of these elements of propaganda, regional actors, and the ecosystem for another Sunni militant group to grow or Shia militant group to grow, I think the situation is going to stay the same for quite a while. Sorry for non-optimism answer, but that's but facts are facts.
I have a question. Yeah. How do you keep from being personally discouraged when so many so-called experts who should understand this better than they do?
Yeah, I mean, in the case of Iran, I think it's a hard country to study. I mean, a lot of countries are hard countries to study, but when a country is a closed society and you don't even have the ability to really freely go there, as somebody who's a human rights defender or journalist, that makes it very tricky to cover. And so I do understand why a lot of folks, I don't want to say that they got it wrong. Yeah, they got it wrong. And it wasn't intentional. It's just that the conditions are not really conducive to being able to understand everything that one needs to understand. Also because, after June 2009, most international journalists were expelled from the country. Others were jailed. Iran ranked really low on press freedom, and they were one of the highest number, countries that had the highest number of journalists jailed. I think Turkey was leading that list for a long time. Yeah, but Iran's up there, and so so that makes it a challenge to obviously get accurate information, to really understand what's going on. And so it's not so much that I'm frustrated by that. I do think that what does frustrate me, just from a human rights perspective, because what I work on is solely, it's very fixated on human rights. If there was a political governance structure that was not democratic, but somehow magically, everybody's human rights were respected, which won't happen because it's quite synonymous with democracy, I find. But if that was the case, there could be an appeal in that, because at the end of the day, I'm just trying to safeguard that. And what frustrates me is that sometimes, people have other agendas, and they think that they will put human rights at the last, like it is the last concern. Other times it's used as a pretext for things that have nothing to do with human rights. So my frustration is in the manipulation of the term human rights and what that really means. And when it's either given short shrift or it's used disingenuously for other aims that have nothing to do with actually being concerned about the human rights of people, inalienable or otherwise.
Okay, before we leave, I just have one question to put this at a positive note, because I know we've been kind of talking about the negative aspects of these countries. So when it comes to looking at the MENA region from a Western perspective, most people don't think of puppies and roses. They see war-torn nations, for the most part, rampant sectarianism and ethnic violence, religious conservatism, and more negative attributes towards the nations. Obviously, there's more to the MENA region than just continuous conflict. We have famous poets such as Nizar Qabbani, one of the most world-famous Iraqi architects, Zaha Hadid, Mohammed Faris, who was the first Syrian to go to the moon, as well as the well-known Iranian Maryam Mirzakhani, who is a world-renowned mathematician, and more. What can we do more to enlighten that aspect of the MENA region? There is so much culture and rich history in the region, and that is not what most people think about when they look at the Middle East or North Africa.
Well, I think the crowd in this room is, I'm guessing, and maybe I shouldn't have assumed that, but I would assume it's a crowd that follows these events, understands something about the region. Otherwise, I doubt you'd RSVP to this particular talk. And so I don't feel as much the need to emphasize all of that, because I think you probably understand the nuance with that. Because yes, it's obvious. Iran at least, it was the Persian Empire. There's so much rich culture. So I think that goes without saying that all still exists. Just because a country has poor governance is not a reflection on the riches of its people. It's just the government that's in place and the path that it's been on, and that is also not isolated from international factors that got it there, right? So there was a great statesman in Iran named Mossadegh, and he was pushed out by a coup that was led by the US and the UK. So all of this is connected, and I think I appreciate ending that on a positive note. But yes, the country is it's full of cultural riches that I think we're all blessed to have, and that have influenced everybody around the world. It's just at the moment we are suffering from poor governance, and that does inhibit. One thing that it does lead to is brain drain, which is something that's very real. And I think some of our best and brightest are leaving the country because they don't have opportunities there. They're stifled. They can't express themselves freely. They can't associate freely, and that has negative consequences in the long term. So to your point, I think the case for good governance in Iran goes beyond just that immediate sense of wanting to combat dictatorship and safeguard the human rights of people and the civil rights of people. It also goes to actually ensuring that it can live up to its best potential, as it did for centuries before this brief period in its history.
Well, around about a year ago, we started a program in my organization called ASAP, which is focused on mostly showing the positive trends that I think sometimes not covered enough. For example, in Tunisia, they had the LGBT rights conference, and we were pushing some of these kind of advertising some of these positive things, mainly because many people lose hope. And if the only thing you see from Iraq and you go on the news is there is a suicide bomber there is a law being passed that says marriage is being lowered to age 9, right? And you see all of these extremely negative news, which are true. That's the thing, is I mean, and in multiple countries there are good things happening and bad things happening at the same time. But I think, I mean, there are books, multiple books written about the subject is how the brain generally goes to the negative news because there's a survival default. I'm not a neuroscientist, I'm not gonna explain it. But is that, I mean, so one of our major programs called ASAPS is focused on showing that there is a significant amount of young people within the Arab world who adhere to values, what we refer to as enlightenment values, civil liberties, importance of women's rights, and the goal of the program is to show that these people actually exist, and they organize conferences and workshops. I mean, to give you an example, even though it might not be a positive one, but the God Delusion by Richard Dawkins got downloaded 13 million times in the Arab world. And there's so many book festivals right now happening in Baghdad, in Kurdistan, in Egypt, in Tunisia, in which many of the books that are considered banned and because they are atheistic or they talk about women's rights in a more feminist language are now being downloaded as PDFs. There are tens of thousands of people downloading these books. There are movements organized about it, like, for example, like Iraqi liberals now have about 2 million followers on Facebook. How many of them are Russian trolls, I don't know, but I would say that a significant, seeing the engagement in many of these pages and watching, I mean, I'm a frequent, I watch Arab media a lot and I watch Iraqi media a lot, and there are constant talks about the rise of feminism in Iraq and the rise of like readership projects and that's one of the things that we highlight a lot by pitching their news to the Arab media, number one, because I think that unfortunately, as she mentioned, of closed societies, is that not many people know that these things also happen in their neighborhood. So we want to advocate that within the region as well as showing to the West is that there is still a significant hope in that part of the world, and that's the reason why I'm doing what I'm doing. If I find it completely hopeless, I wouldn't start an NGO from the scratch. So I definitely believe in that there is an element of hope there.
That's great. So I want to conclude. Oh, do you have a question?
Yeah, well, I think you kind of alluded to what I was interested in. I was just kind of curious about Tunisia and where you see it going now, because I believe the Arab Spring started there, and from what I've heard, they had elections, I think, last year, and things are sort of moving in a better direction than there was just a sense. So can you talk about Tunisia and talk about that a little bit further? You mentioned it a little bit there, but
Yeah, and I mentioned at the beginning that I mean, Tunisia, there's a book that I highly recommend called Tunisia, Arab Anomaly, and it talks about what makes Tunisia unique in a sense by comparison to other states, and the argument is that they were predisposed to democracy. They had a very good education system that was to some extent liberalized. Tunisia itself has a history of a version of a reformed Islam that is compatible with what we call now modern enlightened values. And as for the future, I mean, because it's the only state that has some of these unique characteristics, it is possible that many other countries in the region will try to make sure that it fails. So I mean, Tunisia is under threat by many countries in the region who feel that if that model of Tunisian model is called succeeded, then the Saudis or the countries will make sure that this, and what is sometimes kind of contradictory about Tunisia is that while it has the highest number of women wearing bikini on the beach, it has the highest number of ISIS recruits going to blow themselves in Libya, which is very interesting case, is that there is a significant amount of kind of young people who that kind of secular society is pushing them away to kind of the extreme. So Tunisia is a very, very interesting case that I think needs to be, defended as much as possible, because they can be the hope of really spreading the values of compatibility between Islam and modern and human rights values. And I wish them all the best.
And just one more question.
We kind of talked about the women in Arab culture, but it was more about the female activists and their role in the Arab Spring. But I did my research on the women in the Arab Spring, and what I found was that there is a lot of change in legal ways, but there is no change in culture, and men in Arab culture doesn't
Well, I mean, as I mentioned, like the Arab Spring. I mean, sometimes it's called the Arab Winter because it has some failure, and I mean, I definitely believe that no successful Arab Spring would ever happen without a cultural and a social revolution, and that would lead to more expansion of women's rights and their civil liberties. So, I mean, there is this kind of belief that I think is a false belief that was said during the Iraq War, is that many people are predisposed to believe in freedom. I think that may be cool theoretically, but culture and sometimes religious extremism can be a major barrier of why of the belief in freedom. So I mean, look at places. Forget about the Middle East. I mean, look at places like Brooklyn, Williamsburg, Brooklyn, in which we have ultra-Orthodox Jews. They live in one of the most, I would say, the most diverse city on the planet Earth, and they live in the United States. But culture is a barrier of why women who live under ultra-Orthodox communities, or even the Amish community to some extent, face. So multiply that, so you have the cultural, also you have a closed society in which really not many people are allowed to talk to each other or having these very important discussions. You have a combination of culture and barrier to exchange of knowledge, exchange of ideas, and then what you have is a really complicated. I mean, Manat wrote this book, even though this article of foreign policy. She said, "Why Arab men hate us." I don't like the title because I think it's a bit of a generalization, but hashtag not all. But she goes on detail about how, I mean, the culture, the patriarchal culture that exists in some parts of the Arab world, which are sometimes connected to a radical version of religion, have stopped many women of gaining their rights. And this has kind of shifted over the time. I mean, if you look at Iraq or Syria, pre-Ba'ath Party in the 60s and the 50s and 60s, there were kind of a cultural revolution that when you see more women attending in universities, you see women actors and they're going to theaters. You see like many of these, at least social liberties, being there in many of these countries. But then, I mean, there's the year that sometimes like 1979, in which when the Iran Revolution happened, and then in Saudi Arabia, the movement took over Mecca, and then Saudi Arabia moved to more Wahhabi / Islamist. The Arab world and women's rights are not are not in the best shape. But I think that, as I mentioned, that on the positive note angle, is that there are so many discussions happening right now, while in the West, Facebook and Twitter are sometimes most associated with fake news, but in the Arab world, it's really the only gateway in which feminists and secularists and liberals have their place to actually have these discussions. And I think that we're possibly going to the right direction.
Well, this was a really, really great conversation because it's not that easy to talk about the Middle East and North African region because it's very intricate.
Well, I want that beer. That's for sure.
But I want to thank the speakers for coming here and giving us their great knowledge on this region. And I want to thank you guys for coming here. And I'm also happy that Scott helped formulate the event. And other than that, I hope you guys have a great night. Thank you.